Welcome to this lecture on sociological theory and Max Weber. You probably know Max Weber already as the founder of German sociology and as the founder as well of the Verstehen, the understanding approach of interpretative sociology. Weber could also be said to be the founder of cultural sociology, as well of historical and historical comparative sociology. So many reasons to talk about Weber. This is only one lecture. One could give many more lectures. I will focus here on the more economic sociology in Max Weber, with the Protestant ethic being the reading for today. So as a little bit of background, let's see how this single person, Max Weber, arrived at producing what has recently been fully published as the complete works of Max Weber, that here include also all of his correspondence and all of the non-published works. So Max Weber was born in 1864 as a citizen of Prussia in Erfurt. His father was a member of the imperial diet. His mother came from a pietist Protestant textile a capitalist family, and as you notice already, he comes from a very bourgeois background that enabled him also to basically live on the private wealth of his wife. He was born also as a Prussian man in the German Empire, that is, according to also one of his biographers, whom I cite down here, Dirk Kessler, an expert on Max Weber in Germany, was a very nationalist state, militaristic state, reflected also in Max Weber's own biography. He spent a year in the military at young age. He was recruited also as, in a way, a manager of a military hospital during the First World War, in which he also expressed himself as a very nationalist kind of author. He was part of a fraternity, so these rather conservative student associations, only accepting men, in which very strong drinking culture and also fighting was part of the tradition. And Max Weber also held up the idea of an honor, a code of honor. So when his later wife, Marianne Weber, who herself was a social reformer and author, was publicly criticized for her works, Max Weber also called for a duel. And yeah, luckily survived this incident. So last but not least, Weber was part also of that German Empire, which was born in 1871 and which then also ceased to exist, at least as a monarchy, almost at the end of Weber's life. So Weber also died as a consequence of the Spanish flu in 1920 then. I already mentioned the importance of Weber's family background. So Weber was basically known with the intellectual figures of his time already during his adolescence, and had read most of the literature before entering university even. His brother, Alfred Weber, is also known up to the current day for one of the founding fathers of geography and economic geography. And part of this background is also what is often referred to in Germany as the Bildungsbürgertum, or the educated bourgeoisie. That is a part of the bourgeoisie that inherits the positions in government, in the public administration, also in university above all, and that draws its recognition mainly from culture and from education, not so much from economic resources. That would be then the economic bourgeoisie, that is a little bit opposed to that Bildungsbürgertum. Yeah. So at the time, it was already important when Weber grew up how the different disciplines came to be institutionalized, in which also Weber then performed his own studies. And there were important controversies about how to organize the modern social sciences, and we will see this also in a second, with one fraction arguing that it should become a kind of historical science, and Weber was quite in favor of that view, and another fraction arguing for it becoming another natural science. So Weber then studied national economics, as it was called, and law in particular at the time. He became himself a young professor in the 1890s in national economics. That was the economics of that time. And he was not only an academic, but also a social reformer. He was part of the so-called Association for Social Reform, Verein für Sozialpolitik, in Germany, which was an important think tank that grouped together academics, but also civil servants, mayors, in favor of a more reform-based kind of political approach. He was also politically active. He was himself very close to being a so-called national liberal. There was a party fraction between, let's say, more conservative nationalist parties and the Liberal Party. So if you want a kind of party that would defend economic patriotism, for instance. Yes, he was also the founder and promoter of sociology, a co-founding member of the German Sociological Association in 1909. And the unsuccessful promoter of the kind of sociology he privileged, that is historic comparative kind of sociology, which eventually is not the kind of sociology that nowadays is standardly taught in German universities. He was also partly an editor of the so-called Archive for Social Sciences, in which also many of his own writings appeared. Weber taught at the university, but only for quite a short time, because due to overwork, mostly he had a nervous breakdown in around 1900 and retired basically to being just a private scholar in the years 1903 to 1918, mainly living on the wealth then of his wife's family, Marianne Weber. I mentioned her already. At the end of his life, Weber had to take on another university position. Much of the private wealth was also used up, and he shortly also then taught in Munich and Vienna. Much of Weber's status as a classic nowadays is historically constructed, not during his lifetime, but rather after his death. And Marianne Weber plays a key role here. She did not only manage to publish many of the unfinished writings together with Johannes Winkelmann around 1920, and onwards, establishing something like the corpus of Weberian works. But she also held, for instance, in Heidelberg, the famous Jour Fixe, during which she invited many important scholars. Talcott Parsons also traveled to Germany, did his PhD there on the topic of capitalism among the German sociological authors. And it was also through Parsons' translations of the Weberian works that Max Weber started to have a career also among the English-speaking audience. In short, Weber's status as a classic is not just, let's say, intrinsically motivated, but there's certainly an a case to be made for the social construction also of Weber as a classic. And these elements also, according to Dirk Hassler here, play an important role in that story. So Weber published quite a heterogeneous body of texts. They are both academic, but Weber also participated in public debates. Two of his most read texts, and they are still readable nowadays, are speeches that he gave to students, one about science as a professional calling, another one on politics as a vocation, and these are really still readable texts, very close also to what young politicians and young social scientists may encounter during their careers. Many of his texts were published during the lifetime of Weber already, but there were also many more post-mortal publications. The most important one probably also being Weber's Economy and Society project, an enormous project in which Weber wanted to compare the economic institutions and their interplay between economy and society in a variety of different continents. Weber did not leave something like Weber's school, so he didn't have a lot of disciples that would sort of that he would leave as an inheritance. But yeah, as we saw in the graphs on the history of citations of Weber, Weber is still a very prominent author even nowadays, despite of not having a school of his own. In his career of publications, there are these so-called dark years, which also coincide with his first nervous breakdowns. And they also mark a certain divide in his oeuvre. So the younger Weber before that time wrote a lot about agrarian history. He compared also ancient civilizations, so Mesopotamia versus Egypt, with a strong focus also on interpreting the different agricultural institutions of these societies. He wrote a dissertation also on the role of societies or corporations that survived as a Roman law institution in medieval age and built something like the backbone then of modern corporations of the type of the East India Company or yeah, even transnational organizations nowadays. In his then later writing, he turns much more to, first of all, religion. So the reading also for today, the Protestant ethics and society, but obviously also economy and society, and develops much more of a historic comparative approach, economy and society also containing just many, many definitions, still important nowadays. What is power? What is governance? What is a bureaucracy? And I will touch a little bit on this also later. Just a brief classification of his works. So I didn't mention so far his text in the methodology of the social sciences, more of the young Weber also writing about this. The later writing, Sociology of Religion, which is not just the Protestant ethic. I will briefly mention this also in this talk. There are political articles. Weber learned Russian within very few weeks in order to read Russian newspapers during the 1905 revolution to comment on these political events in German newspapers. I mentioned the speeches, but he also wrote basically research on at command for the Association for Social Politics. So for instance, he wrote a report on the conditions of East Albion